She was a black woman in blue scrubs standing between a dozen armed men and an operating room door. And she didn't move an inch. The guns came in first, then the blood. Then the most feared crime lord in South Korea, bleeding out on a gurney, watching her with eyes that had never seen anything like her. Everyone else in that emergency room had pressed themselves against the walls. Doctors, nurses, security guards who'd forgotten what courage felt like. Not Nyla Mercer. If you've ever stood alone against something that should have broken you, this story is yours. Like this video, drop a comment with the city you're watching from, and let's see how far this story travels. The storm hit Seoul the way bad news always did, without warning and all at once. By 9:17 on a Tuesday night in October, the rain was coming down so hard it sounded like static, like the city itself had lost signal, and the emergency department at Hanguk Central Hospital was already stretched to the point of tearing. Flu season had stacked the waiting room 4 deep. A construction worker with a broken femur had been screaming in Bay 3 for 40 minutes because the attending orthopedic resident was still stuck in traffic somewhere on the flooded Gangnam Expressway. 2 of the trauma nurses had called out sick. The supply cart for Bay 7 had been logged as restocked but wasn't, which Nyla Mercer had already noticed and already fixed and already documented in the system, all before the clock hit 9. She moved through that emergency room the way certain people move through chaos. Not around it, not above it, but straight through the middle of it, touching every point of disorder and leaving behind something steadier. She was 31 years old, 5 feet 6, with hands built for precision work and a voice trained not to rise. She had been in Seoul for 2 years, brought over on a contract medical exchange program through a global trauma initiative, and she had stayed because the work was real here, and she did not know how to do anything that wasn't. She had a list of things she did not tolerate in a trauma bay. The list was not written anywhere. It lived in the way she positioned herself in a room, in the particular quality of silence she produced when someone was about to do something wrong. The night nurses knew the list. The residents learned it fast. It included unnecessary noise during a procedure, family members who touched equipment without consent, pharmaceutical waste logged incorrectly, and anyone who entered a sterile corridor without clearance. She was checking vitals on an elderly man in Bay 2, a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Huang, who had come in with chest pressure and turned out to have anxiety, which she had quietly and correctly suspected before the EKG confirmed it. She was explaining to him, in her careful and still improving Korean, that his heart was structurally fine, and that what he needed was water and rest when she heard it. The sound didn't come from inside the department. It came from the ambulance bay. The hydraulic groan of the heavy bay doors, then voices pitched wrong, too many and too controlled, the specific flatness of men who had been trained to manage adrenaline. She heard it through the ceiling, through the floor, through some frequency she'd developed over years of working in places where emergencies arrived angry. She set down Mr. Huang's chart, excused herself, and walked to the corridor. The ambulance doors opened and the rain blew in sideways, and with it came 6 men in dark clothing and 1 body on a gurney, and the body was losing blood through a wound in the left side of his chest at a rate that told Nyla, in the first 3 seconds of looking, that they had maybe 11 minutes before the situation became unrecoverable. The 6 men came in moving. That was the first problem. They moved like they owned the space, like the distinction between public hospital and private territory was a thing they had already settled internally. And what struck her, beyond the weapons, beyond the blood, beyond the sheer volume of them filling the corridor, was that not one of them was looking at the man on the gurney. They were looking at the doors, the windows, the staff who had frozen in the hallway like startled deer. They were scanning, securing. The second problem was the weapons. 2 had them visible, compact, matte, holstered, but unsnapped. The others moved with the particular weight shift that told Nyla their jackets were not empty. She had grown up in Baltimore. She knew what concealed looked like. She knew what ready looked like. The third problem was that Dr. Park Sung-jin, the attending trauma physician currently at the top of the rotation, had stepped backward until his shoulders touched the supply cabinet, and he was staring at the man on the gurney with an expression that was not triage. It was recognition. Whatever he knew about who this was, it had taken the medicine right out of him. Nyla walked forward. She did not run. Running in a trauma corridor when you needed people to remain calm was one of the things she did not do. She walked with the kind of deliberate unhurry that she had learned communicated control better than speed, and she put herself between the gurney and the corridor entrance, and she looked at the man closest to her, tall, wide, a jaw like poured concrete, and she said in English first and then in Korean, "Weapons stay outside the corridor. That's not a request." The man looked at her the way people look at something that has said something deeply unexpected. His hand didn't move toward the holster, but it didn't move away from it either. "You understand what I'm telling you?" she said. Her voice was flat. Not aggressive, not afraid, just flat, the way a wall is flat. "I will not begin treatment until every firearm is outside this corridor. You have 20 seconds. From the gurney, a sound. Not a word. A sound from the man bleeding out, a short, bitten exhale, the kind a person produces when they are expending the last of their breath on something they have decided matters. The large man glanced at the gurney. The man on it, impossibly, moved his hand. A small gesture. 2 fingers dropped once, like a conductor cutting off a section. The large man stepped back. The others followed. Not fast. With the specific slowness of men who needed it, understood that they were choosing to comply. But they stepped back. "Thank you," Nyla said, and she was already moving, already calling back over her shoulder, already in triage mode. "Dr. Park, I need you right now. Bay 1. Someone get me a second line started, and I want 2 units of O-neg pulled. I don't care what the blood bank says about inventory, pull them now." She got to the gurney and looked at the patient for the first time as a patient. He was somewhere in his late 30s, powerfully built, even in the flat ruin of blood loss, with a face that had been struck and struck again over the course of a life, and had settled into something that was not handsome in any conventional way, but was impossible to look away from. The wound was a through and through on the left lateral chest, below the nipple line, which put the liver and the spleen both in question, and the entry was ragged in a way that suggested a larger caliber at close range. Someone had packed it with what looked like a torn shirt. It was soaked completely through. His eyes were open. That was the part that caught her, just for a half second. His eyes were open, and they were completely, unnervingly alert. Men this far into blood loss usually drifted. They went somewhere internal. Their gaze went soft at the edges. This man was looking directly at her with eyes that were dark and still and fully present, and there was something in them she couldn't immediately classify. Not fear, not anger, something more like attention. He was paying attention to her the way someone pays attention to a thing they did not expect to exist. "Kang Tae-hyun," Dr. Park said from behind her, his voice low and strained as he finally forced himself forward. He said it the way you say a name you hoped you'd never have to say in a professional context. "I don't need his name," Nyla said. "I need his pressure. Get me a reading." Park fumbled with the cuff. 80/50. "Starting to crash. We need the OR." She looked down at the man, at Tae-hyun, and said directly to him, because she believed in addressing conscious patients as conscious patients, "I'm going to take care of you. I need you to stay with me. Can you do that?" His mouth moved. The word was in Korean, but she had learned enough to catch it. He said, "Yes." She believed him, not because patients in his condition usually kept their word, because the way he said it sounded like the first promise he'd made in a long time that he intended to keep. The next 40 minutes were the kind that Nyla had trained for and dreaded and ultimately lived for. The combination of crisis that stripped every layer of ceremony off medicine and left only the essential question, is this person going to live or die, and what am I going to do about it? Dr. Park recovered himself in the OR. He was competent. She'd always known that. It was only the name on the gurney that had briefly unmade him. And together they worked the chest cavity with the focused ferocity of people who understood that whatever Kang Tae-hyun was outside this room was not their business, and whoever he was in here was their only concern. The spleen had caught a nick. The liver had been spared by what Nyla could only describe as geometry. The angle of entry had been deflected by the 8th rib, which had partially fractured and redirected the trajectory with a millimeter's margin. She had seen uglier. She had also seen more forgiving, and she did not allow herself to think about probability while her hands were inside a chest cavity. Probability was for statisticians. The OR was for decisions. He made it. She knew the moment the pressure stabilized and the monitors stopped arguing. She felt it the way you feel a room change when rain stops. Not loud, just different. She stepped back, pulled off her gloves, let the resident close under Park's supervision, and walked out of the OR and into the scrub room and stood at the sink and ran cold water over her wrists until her pulse came down to something she recognized. Then she dried her hands, updated the chart, and went back to work. She did not think about the men in the corridor. She did not think about the guns. She thought about Mr. Huang in Bay 2, who had probably scared himself half to death sitting alone with his anxiety while the department erupted around him. And she went and sat with him for 7 minutes and explained again, slowly, what anxiety did to the chest and why it felt exactly like the thing it wasn't. Kang Tae-hyun was moved to a private recovery room on the 4th floor at 1:17 in the morning. Nyla signed the transfer paperwork and did not expect to see him again. She was wrong about that. He came back 6 days later, not as an emergency. He walked through the front entrance of Hanguk Central at 10 in the morning wearing a dark jacket and moving with the careful deliberateness of a man whose left side was still healing, accompanied by 1 man instead of 6. And he went to the reception desk and asked to speak to the nurse who had been in the emergency room on the night of October 14th. The receptionist called upstairs. The charge nurse called Nyla's cell. Nyla was on her lunch break in the 4th floor break room eating rice and kimchi she'd made herself because the cafeteria had stopped surprising her months ago. She listened to the message twice. Then she went downstairs. He was sitting in one of the waiting room chairs, the plastic molded kind that no adult with a functional spine would choose voluntarily, with his large frame arranged with some difficulty into what passed for a relaxed posture. His one companion stood 3 paces back, hands visible, the stance of someone who had been told to look non-threatening and was doing his best. Tae-hyun was looking at his hands. When Nyla came through the security door, he stood up, slowly, and she could see the micro-expression of pain that crossed his face when his left side pulled. "You should be resting," she said. "That repair is 6 days old." "I know," he said. His English was careful and precise, carrying an accent shaped by somewhere she couldn't immediately place. Not the soul intonation she'd been learning, something older in it, rougher around certain consonants. "I came to thank you." "You don't need to thank me. It's my job." "I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "I came anyway." She looked at him for a moment. He was, in the daylight of a hospital waiting room, a different kind of presence than he'd been on a trauma gurney. There was mass to him, not just physical. The quality some people carry of having made very large decisions and lived inside the consequences. His face still had that quality she'd noticed in the OR. That attention. Like the act of looking at something was something he took seriously. "You can sit," she said. "You shouldn't be standing on that long." He sat. She sat across from him, not beside him, which she chose deliberately because it maintained the particular distance that she preferred to maintain with patients when she was off the clock. His companion remained standing. "Your man," Tae-hyun said, nodding slightly toward his bodyguard. "He will not cause trouble. He is only here because—" He paused, seemed to edit himself. "It is a habit." "One of many, I'd imagine," Nyla said. Something shifted very slightly at the corners of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something that was aware of where a smile would be. "Yes," he said. She asked him how his breathing was. He told her. She asked him about the pain management protocol Park's team had sent him home with. He admitted he'd taken half the dosage because he didn't trust the feeling of impairment. She told him that was deeply unwise and that pain management after a chest repair wasn't optional. He listened to this with the expression of someone who was used to issuing instructions rather than receiving them and was finding the experience, if not pleasant, then at least interesting. He came back 4 days after that. His stitches needed checking, he said, which was not technically false but was, Nyla suspected, not the entire truth. She checked the stitches. They were healing correctly. She told him this. He asked how long before he could resume. He paused for the right word. Physical activity. She told him 6 weeks minimum, no exceptions, and watched his jaw set with the controlled frustration of a man who was not accustomed to being given timelines he didn't construct himself. He came back the week after that. And the week after that. Each time there was a reason. A follow-up question about the scar tissue. A request for paperwork for some insurance matter she suspected was invented. Once he said he had a headache, which was so transparently an excuse that she actually laughed. A short, involuntary sound that surprised her, and he looked at her laugh the way someone looks at something they have wanted to see happen and did not expect to get to see. She was not unaware of what he was doing. She was not unaware of what it meant, that the most feared criminal figure in Seoul's underworld kept manufacturing reasons to sit in a hospital waiting room and talk to her. She was also not, she told herself firmly and repeatedly, susceptible to it. She had not come to Seoul to be swept into the orbit of someone whose life operated by rules she did not recognize. But he was, and this was the part she did not tell herself firmly, the part she just noticed, quietly, in the privacy of her own attention. He was different in person than the version of him that existed in the city's nervous system, the version she'd heard about, in the low voices her Korean coworkers used when they talked around him rather than about him. That version was pure velocity, pure force, an engine of consequence that ran over anything slow enough to be caught. The man who sat across from her in a plastic hospital chair and tried to describe, in careful halting English mixed with Korean, she was now able to follow 3 words in 5, what he had eaten for breakfast. That man was doing something she couldn't name. He was being ordinary. He was trying it out, like a person who has lived for years in a house without windows and has finally opened one and is not sure yet what to call the air. She noticed. She did not say she noticed. It was during his 5th visit, the headache visit, the one that made her laugh, that she mentioned it. Not directly. They had been sitting for longer than the usual pretense of his visit warranted, and she had been telling him about a patient she'd had that morning, a teenage boy who had come in with a broken wrist from skateboarding, terrified, certain the bone was worse than it was, and she had spent 20 minutes with him just explaining the anatomy, showing him on a model, turning the fear into information. Taehyun had listened to this the way he listened to everything, fully, without the impatience she'd expected from someone who seemed to operate at a pace most people couldn't track. "You did that?" he said. 20 minutes, just for him, she said. He was scared. "That's the same as a broken bone. You treat it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No one thinks that way." "Some people do. Not in my experience." "Then your experience has been limited," she said, which she knew was a blunt thing to say, and said it anyway, because bluntness was one of the tools she used to keep a distance she was starting to find harder to maintain. He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't bristle. He looked at the middle distance between them and said quietly, "Yes, that is probably true." She went home that night and sat in her apartment in Mapogu and ate leftover rice and looked at her phone and thought about her brother, Marcus, who was supposed to have called 2 days ago and hadn't. Marcus was 24 and in Seoul on what he described as a digital media opportunity that Nyla had been unable to get a clear definition of, and she had been worried about him in the background noise way that older sisters worry about younger brothers who have always had better luck than sense. She called him. He didn't answer. She left a message. She told herself she would try again tomorrow and went to sleep. She did not sleep well. The thing she was slowly, against her better judgment, beginning to understand about Kang Tae-hyun was that the version of him the city feared and the version of him she was encountering were not as different as she would have liked them to be. They were the same person. That was the unsettling part. The force that had silenced 6 armed men with a 2-fingered gesture was the same force that was currently being deployed, with far greater care, toward the project of having a real conversation with her. He hadn't turned it off or turned it down. He had simply redirected it. She started noticing other things that happened in the hospital's orbit that she'd been half aware of before but hadn't assembled into a pattern. A family on the 3rd floor, the Lim family, mother with stage 3 cancer, 2 small kids, father working 3 jobs, whose bill had been mysteriously cleared. The charge nurse had shrugged and said the hospital's foundation had a program for hardship cases. The pediatric ward had received an anonymous donation of new equipment that the department had been requesting for 18 months. There was a shelter 2 blocks from the hospital that had quietly doubled its bed capacity over the summer. Nyla had sent patients there and never thought to wonder how it had expanded. She started asking questions. She was careful about how she asked them. She had a way of moving through institutional information. She had learned it in Baltimore, working in a hospital where budget transparency was a polite fiction that didn't announce itself as investigation. She just had conversations. She talked to the billing department supervisor, an older woman named Miss Choi, who had been at Hanguk Central for 22 years, and who liked Nyla because Nyla had once stayed late to help translate instructions for an English-speaking patient when no official translator was available. She talked to the director of the Hardship Fund, who was technically happy to describe the program in general terms. She talked to the shelter coordinator, a tired young man who mentioned, without being asked, that the expansion had been funded by a single private donor who had requested complete anonymity. It took her 3 weeks of peripheral conversations to trace the money to its source. She couldn't prove it in any way that would hold up to serious scrutiny. But the financial architecture, the layering, the indirection, the careful way the donations passed through 2 foundations before landing, was identifiable to someone who had once tried, in a previous life, to become an accountant before medicine had claimed her completely. She sat with what she knew for 4 days before she said anything about it. His 6th visit. He came in on a Thursday, no pretense this time, just walked to the front desk and asked for her by name. And when she came down, he was holding 2 cups of coffee from the cart outside the main entrance, which was such an unexpectedly normal human gesture that she stopped walking for a half-second before she resumed. They sat outside under the overhang because the weather was gray but dry, and she took the coffee because she needed it. And after they had been talking for 10 minutes about nothing, she said, "The Lim family on the 3rd floor, their bill got cleared." He said, "I heard there's a hardship program." "There is," she said. "It's real, but it only covers a portion. The rest came from somewhere else." He drank his coffee. "The pediatric ward equipment," she said. "The shelter on Mapo Daero." He was looking at the street. His profile was very still. "You want to tell me it's coincidence?" she said. "No," he said. She waited. "I want to tell you it's none of your business," he said. "But I don't think you would accept that." "I wouldn't." He turned and looked at her, and there was something in his expression she hadn't seen on him before. Not discomfort exactly, more like the specific exposure of someone who has kept a room locked for a very long time, and someone else has just reached for the handle from the outside. "Does it change anything?" he said. "What you think of me?" She looked at him carefully. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'm still counting." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded, once, as if this was the answer he had expected and had decided to respect. That evening, she called Marcus again. His phone rang 6 times and went to voicemail. She left another message, shorter this time, with less effort in her voice to sound casual. She told him to call her back tonight. He did not call her back that night. By the following morning, when his phone went directly to voicemail without ringing, no dial tone, no ring, just the flat and immediate click of a disconnected signal, she felt it in the place below her sternum where certainty lives before the brain catches up. She called his building. The landlord said he hadn't seen Marcus in 3 days. She called the one friend she'd met, a young Korean-American photographer Marcus had mentioned, and the photographer said he'd been trying to reach him too. She called the number Marcus had given her for his digital media contact, an office number for a company called Vertex Creative Solutions, and the line was answered by an automated message in Korean that she translated as, "The number you have called is no longer in service." She sat in the break room on the 4th floor with a cold cup of coffee and her phone, and she thought about it with the particular stripped-down clarity that fear produces when you refuse to let it become panic. Then she thought about where Marcus had been going in the evenings. He'd mentioned a bar, more than once, in a district she hadn't been to called Chongpa-dong. He'd been vague about who he was meeting. He'd been vague in the specific way young men are vague when they are doing something they know their older sister would object to. Chongpa-dong. She opened her phone and looked at it on a map. Then she looked up what Chongpa-dong was known for, the parts that didn't make the tourism sites. She already knew the answer before she finished reading. She'd heard enough from Dr. Park, from the charge nurses, from the low-register conversations in hospital corridors, to know that Chongpa-dong was one of the territories that belonged to Kang Tae-hyun's organization. She sat with that for 30 seconds. Then she got up, walked to the elevator, rode it to the lobby, and called his number. He picked up on the 2nd ring. "I need to see you," she said. "Not at the hospital." A pause. "When?" "Tonight." Another pause, shorter. "Tell me where you are." She told him. And the second she hung up, she understood that she had just stepped across a line she had spent 6 weeks carefully staying on the right side of. She did not regret it, not yet. She was too afraid for Marcus to afford regret. But she understood it. That night, sitting across from Kang Tae-hyun in a quiet restaurant in Mapogu, with the rain starting up again outside and her hands flat on the table between them, she said, "My brother is missing. The last place anyone knows he was going was Chongpadong." She looked at him directly. "Is that your territory?" His face did not change. "Yes," he said. "Then I need to know if you had anything to do with him disappearing." The rain hit the window. His hands were still on the table across from hers, close but not touching. His eyes did not flinch away. "I didn't," he said. She looked at him for a long time. The man who had silenced 6 armed men with 2 fingers. The man who had secretly been paying the hospital bills of strangers for years. The man who kept coming back to sit in a plastic chair and drink coffee and have conversations he didn't need to have. "You have 12 hours, she said. "If you haven't found him or explained where he is by tomorrow morning, I'm going to the authorities with everything I know." She paused. "And I know more than you think." He looked at her the way he'd looked at her the first time, from the gurney, with that quality of full attention, like she was something he hadn't expected the world to produce and was recalculating accordingly. "I know you do," he said. Then he stood, slowly, the old wound pulling at his side, and she could see in the set of his jaw the moment the force she had witnessed him deploy, that redirected, concentrated force, shifted back into the register it had come from. Not toward her, away from her, outward, toward whatever came next. 12 hours, he said, and he walked out into the rain. Nyla sat alone at the table. The coffee was cold, the rain was picking up. Somewhere in this city her brother was not answering his phone, and she had just handed the most dangerous man in Seoul a deadline and a warning, and she did not know yet if she had made the best decision of her life or the worst. What she knew was this. She had looked into Kang Tae-hyun's eyes and asked him if he'd hurt someone she loved, and he had said no, and she had believed him. She was still deciding what to do with that. The 12 hours started the moment Tae-hyun walked out of that restaurant, and Nyla counted every one of them. She didn't sleep. She went home and sat at her kitchen table with her laptop open and a legal pad beside it, and she wrote down everything she knew about Marcus's movements over the past 3 weeks. Every mention, every casual reference, every detail she'd half-registered and filed away in the part of the brain that stores things you hope you won't need. The digital media job. Vertex Creative Solutions, the company whose phone number was now disconnected. The bar in Chongpadong he'd mentioned twice, once by name. Something that translated roughly as Blue Crane, she thought, though her Korean was still imperfect enough that she wasn't certain. The Korean-American photographer Danny Cho, who'd last seen Marcus 6 days ago and hadn't thought to be worried until Nyla's second call had worried him. She wrote it all down. Then she looked at it and understood that what she had was not evidence of anything except a young man who had made himself scarce, which young men did constantly, without it meaning what she was afraid it meant. But Marcus always called. That was the thing she kept returning to. Whatever else he was, impulsive, careless with money, constitutionally unable to plan further than 48 hours ahead, he had always called. Every week, without exception, since she had come to Seoul. It had been their agreement, the one condition she had put on supporting his move here. Once a week, a real conversation, not a text. He had not once missed it in 18 months. This was day 9 of silence. At 3 in the morning, she called Danny Cho again. He answered on the first ring, which told her he hadn't been sleeping either. "Tell me again about the last time you saw him," she said. Danny's voice was tightly controlled in the way of someone managing guilt. "It was a Thursday, last week. We were supposed to shoot some content for this thing he was working on. He had this idea for a documentary series about Seoul street markets. We were in Mapo. He got a call, took it outside, came back and said he had to go meet someone, said it was work. I asked if he wanted to reschedule, and he said he'd text me." "He didn't text you?" "No." "Did you hear anything about the call? Any name? Any—" "He said—" Danny stopped. "He said something when he came back inside. I almost didn't hear it. He said, 'I'm going to Chongpa,' just like that. Like it was nothing." Nyla wrote it down, though she already knew it. "Did he seem scared?" A pause. "No," Danny said slowly. "That's the thing. He seemed excited. She stayed on the line with Danny for another 10 minutes, extracting every peripheral detail she could. Marcus had been tight-lipped about the work, in a way that Danny had read as normal, creative industry discretion. He'd had money recently. Not a lot, but more than his stated income explained, new shoes, dinners at places he'd previously complained were too expensive. He'd mentioned once that he was working with some investors who were seriously connected, and had laughed when he said it, the way someone laughs at a phrase they find impressive and slightly unreal. She hung up, looked at the window. The rain had stopped somewhere in the last hour, and Seoul was doing the thing it did at 4 in the morning when the storm cleared. That strange, still luminosity, light reflected off wet streets, the city looking cleaned and dishonest. She thought about what Ta-hyun had said when she'd told him the 12 hours. I know you do, not I'll find him, not I promise. Just that acknowledgement, direct and unornamented. The acknowledgement of a man who understood that she had assessed him, and the assessment had limits and was telling him so. She had 7 hours left. Across the city, in a building in Yeongdeungpo that did not have his name on any document related to it, Kang Tae-hyun was not sleeping either. He was sitting at the head of a table in a room on the 15th floor with 3 men across from him, and the city spread out behind the glass like a map of something he owned, which he did, in ways that had nothing to do with legal title. The 3 men were his core operations team, not Min-jae. Min-jae was not here yet, which was itself a piece of information Tae-hyun was holding in the back of his mind like a coal you hold through the cold, feeling the burn. His head of logistics, a compact man named Ryu, who had been with him for 11 years. His information officer, a woman named Baek Ji-yeon, who had come to him out of financial intelligence and who was worth, in terms of pure analytical value, more than anyone else in the room. And his security chief, a former military man named Oh Dae-won, who had the stillness of someone who had stood in enough bad situations to know that panic was a luxury. American male, Tae-hyun said. 24. Marcus Mercer. Black American. Likely English speaker only or near only. Last confirmed location, Cheongpa-dong, Thursday of last week. He was in contact with someone in our network. I need to know who. Beck was already on her tablet. Cheongpa-dong Thursday last week. There were 3 active points. She stopped herself at the look on his face. I'll pull the specific contact logs. I need them in 2 hours. 1 hour, she said, which was why he paid her what he paid her. Ryu leaned forward. His voice was careful in the way of a man who has learned that careful voices are safer than accurate ones around certain subjects. Boss, the Mercer name, is this connected to the hospital? Yes. The word landed in the room and did everyone's work for them. Ryu leaned back. Oh, Dae-won didn't move at all. They understood, without being told, what it meant that Tae-hyun was in this room at 3 in the morning running a personal search on a missing foreigner. They were smart enough not to say what they understood. 1 hour, Tae-hyun said. And someone tell Min-jae I want him here. Ryu exchanged a look with Oh that lasted less than a second. He's not answering his phone, Ryu said. Since earlier tonight. Tae-hyun looked at Ryu for a long moment. The coal in the back of his mind got hotter. Find him, he said. Not loud, not emphasized, just a sentence with no room in it for any other interpretation. He stood and walked to the window. Below him, Seoul gleamed and breathed, and somewhere in it was a young man who had walked into his territory with excitement on his face and had not walked back out. And the list of people who could have authorized that kind of move was short, and the name at the top of it belonged to the man who was not answering his phone. Seo Min-jae had been with Tae-hyun for 8 years. He was 36, sharp-faced, educated in ways that he wore like armor, and he had been, for most of that 8 years, the person Tae-hyun trusted most with the operational mechanics of the organization. Not because Min-jae was loyal in the bone-deep way that Ryu was loyal, or steady in the way Oh was steady, but because Min-jae was competent with a comprehensiveness that made loyalty almost beside the point. He got things done. He understood leverage, and he understood timing, and he understood, better than most, how Tae-hyun's mind worked, which was, Tae-hyun understood now, standing at the window with the city below him, exactly the problem. Min-jae knew how his mind worked. Min-jae had watched, for 6 weeks, a pattern he had never seen before. Tae-hyun returning voluntarily to a hospital, Tae-hyun having conversations that went nowhere productive, Tae-hyun looking at a woman across a plastic table with an expression that did not belong on the face of a man who ran what they ran. Min-jae had seen it and had calculated what it meant, what it cost, what it represented in terms of the organization's stability and Tae-hyun's edge, and Min-jae had made a decision. Tae-hyun didn't know all of this yet. He was standing at the window assembling it from the fragments he had. The unanswered phone, the missing American, the territory that was under his name but was operationally supervised in that district by Min-jae. He was close enough to the full picture that his stomach had been wrong for the past 2 hours. Beck came back in 53 minutes. She put her tablet on the table and turned it toward him. Thursday night in Cheongpa-dong, there were 2 contact interactions logged with external individuals. One was routine, a collection handoff. The other one, she paused. The other one was flagged by our system as anomalous, and then the flag was manually removed. Someone with admin access cleared it. Who has admin access to contact logs? You, me, and Lieutenant Seo. The coal burned through. What was the interaction? An American male was brought in through the Blue Crane entrance at 9:40 p.m. He was logged as a voluntary informant prospect. He was taken to the back office. She stopped. There's no exit log. The room was very quiet. No exit log, Tae-hyun said. No. He looked at the table. His hands were flat on the surface, and he made himself keep them flat, because the alternative was picking something up and putting it through the window, and that would not help Marcus Mercer. And it would not help Nyla, and it would not help the particular cold clarity he needed right now. Baek, he said, where is Min-jae? She was already running it. His phone last pinged. She looked up, and something moved in her expression that was not something he often saw there. A warehouse. Seodaemun district. It's an old facility. Off the books. Off whose books? Ours. Originally acquired 3 years ago as a transit point. It was supposed to be decommissioned. She met his eyes. Lieutenant Seo handled the decommission paperwork. He was already standing. Oh, he said. The security chief was on his feet before his name finished. 4 men, armed, now. Neela's phone rang at 5:47 in the morning. She had been sitting at the kitchen table for 2 hours since her last call with Danny, not sleeping, not eating, running through the same circuit of information and hitting the same walls. She looked at the screen. Tae-hyun's number. She picked up. I know where he is. His voice was controlled, but she had learned enough about his register to hear what was underneath it. We are going now. I need you to stay where you are. No, she said immediately. Nyla. Where? A silence that lasted exactly as long as it needed to for him to calculate that arguing would cost him time he didn't have. Seodaemun District. Old warehouse facility. I'm sending you the location. Stay back from the building. Stay on the street. How long? 40 minutes. He hung up. The address came through 30 seconds later. She grabbed her jacket, her phone, her keys, and she was out the door before the lock had finished clicking behind her. She took a cab because the subway wasn't running and driving was not something she trusted herself to do on no sleep and a gut full of fear. The cab driver was a middle-aged man who wanted to make conversation, and she answered his first 3 attempts in monosyllabic Korean, and he read the room and drove in silence. She watched Seoul pass outside the window. The pre-dawn city, still wet from last night. The streetlights starting to compete with the gray coming up in the east. She thought about Marcus at 9 years old, following her around the apartment in Baltimore because their mother was working doubles, and Nyla was 13 and the closest thing to supervision available. She thought about the way he laughed, too loud, always a half-second late, like the joke had to travel further in him before it arrived. She thought about him walking into a bar in Cheongpa-dong with excitement on his face, because someone had told him he was about to get connected to something big. She pressed her fist against her mouth and looked out the window and did not make a sound. The warehouse was in an industrial stretch that the city's redevelopment had not yet reached, a block of squat concrete structures that looked like they were trying not to be noticed. She had the driver stop 2 blocks out, paid him, and walked the rest on foot, following the dropped pin on her phone, staying on the opposite side of the street from the facility. She got there before Tae-hyun's team did. She knew, because the building was dark and still, and there was no vehicle on the street yet. She positioned herself in the shadow of a loading dock across the street, phone in hand, and waited. Her breath made small clouds. The cold was the specific gray cold of early Seoul morning, and it got into her scrubs. She hadn't thought to change, had just put a jacket over them. And she stood in it and watched the warehouse and tried not to think about what no exit log meant. They came in 2 vehicles, no lights, pulling up on the north side of the building at 6:23. She counted the men, 4 plus Taehyun, moving fast and without sound. She could see him even at that distance. The particular way he carried himself, the controlled economy of it, except now there was no economy. He was moving the way she had first seen him move in her imagination from the OR, the version of him the city knew. Velocity and decision bundled together in a body that knew exactly what it was capable of. She didn't move from the shadow. She had said she would stay on the street, and she had meant it, not because he'd told her to, but because she understood that whatever was about to happen inside that building she could not help and might only complicate. The team went in through a side entrance. She heard nothing. That was worse, somehow, than noise. 11 minutes passed. Then the side door opened and 2 figures came out, one supporting the other, and even at 40 meters in the gray pre-dawn light, she recognized the way the supported one moved. The particular loping looseness of her brother's stride, even stumbling, even half-carried. She was across the street before she was aware of having started moving. "Marcus!" Her voice came out level because she made it come out level. She reached him and put her hands on his face and looked at him. A cut above the right eyebrow, dried blood on his collar, eyes that were present but dulled in the way that spoke to hours of fear rather than physical injury. "Look at me. Marcus. Are you hurt?" "Nyla." His voice cracked on her name like a kid's. "Nyla, I didn't know what it was. I swear they said it was a job. They said—" "Later," she said. "Are you hurt?" "My wrist. I think they tied." She ran her hands down his arms, found the wrist, felt the swelling that told her ligament stress without fracture, probably. Not certainly. She would need imaging. She looked at the man who had been supporting him, one of Tae-hyun's, a man named Ryu she had seen once before. And he stepped back with a nod, and she got under Marcus's arm and took his weight. She looked for Tae-hyun. He was not with the group that had come out. "Where is he?" she asked Ryu. Ryu's expression shifted into something careful. "Inside," he said. "There was a—" He stopped, selected different words. "There is a situation." She heard it then. Not gunfire. A single impact, the specific dense sound of a contained explosion of violence. Not a weapon, something harder and more personal. Then another. Then silence. She stood on the street with her brother's weight on her shoulder and looked at the warehouse entrance. 3 minutes later, Tae-hyun came out. He was upright. That was the first thing. He was moving under his own power, which was information, but his left hand was pressed against his left side, and in the pre-dawn light she could see the dark spread of it, the wrong color against the dark jacket. He had opened the chest wound, or something inside that warehouse had opened it for him. He walked toward her and his pace was controlled, but she could see the cost of the control. The jaw set, the specific over-deliberateness of someone whose body was reporting damage and whose mind was refusing to process it until the immediate situation resolved. He looked at Marcus first. His eyes did a rapid inventory. Some of the set in his jaw eased fractionally. Then he looked at her. "I told you to stay on the street," he said. "I was on the street," she said. "You came to me." He almost did something with his face. Not quite. "You're bleeding," she said. "I know." "How bad?" "The repair held," he said. "I think." She looked at his hand against his side. The spread was not accelerating, which was something, but she needed light and equipment to know what something was worth. "We're going to the hospital," she said. "Not yet." His voice had that quality again. The closed door. "There is something I need to tell you first." She looked at him. Around them, his men were doing the things men do when they are waiting for a situation to be defined. Staying close, staying quiet, watching the perimeter. "Min Jae," he said. The name came out flat, like a fact he was delivering at personal cost. "Seo Min Jae, he is my—" A pause. "He was my closest operational officer. He arranged this. Your brother was brought in because Min Jae needed leverage. Against me. He looked at her steadily. He wanted to use Marcus to force a decision I refused to make, and he wanted to destroy whatever trust you had in me. The word trust landed between them in the cold air. She looked at him. She looked at the blood spreading slowly behind his hand. She looked at her brother, who had gone quiet against her shoulder with the silence of someone who has understood only pieces of the situation he is standing inside. And Min Jae, she said carefully, where is he now? Taehyun held her gaze. He will not be a problem. It was not an answer. It was also not the kind of non-answer she could push on right now. On this street, in this light, with her brother bleeding and Taehyun bleeding and the cold morning coming up around all of them. Get in the car, she said. Both of you. We're going to Hanguk Central and you're going to let me look at that side and then, her voice stayed level with effort. Then you are going to tell me everything. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded and moved toward the vehicle, slow and careful, and she watched him move and understood something that she had been resisting understanding for 6 weeks. She was not a person who fell easily into anything. She had built her whole adult life on the principle of keeping her feet under her. She had come to Seoul specifically to work in a place where the work was the point, and nothing else was supposed to complicate it. She looked at Kang Tae-hyun getting into a car at 6:30 in the morning, bleeding from a wound he'd reopened, rescuing her brother from his own lieutenant. And she understood that the complication had already happened, that it had been happening incrementally through every plastic chair visit and cold coffee and quiet conversation. And that what she had been telling herself was careful distance was something that she had been telling herself was careful. Distance was something that had already failed, quietly and completely, the way a levee fails. Not at once, but incrementally, and then all at once, and by the time you know it has happened, the water is already somewhere it was never supposed to be. She got into the car. The drive to Hanguk Central took 19 minutes. She spent 14 of them with her hand pressed against Taehyun's left side, feeling the warmth of blood seeping through the jacket, counting his respirations with the automatic precision of someone whose body had learned to assess vital signs the way other people check the time. His breathing was elevated but not labored. The wound had not reopened catastrophically. The original repair was holding at the margins. She told herself these things in the clinical language she used when the patient was someone she needed to stay detached from, and the clinical language did approximately nothing to slow her pulse. Marcus sat in the front seat in silence. She could see the line of his shoulders, the rigid, over-controlled posture of someone holding themselves together through sheer structural effort. His wrist was in her jacket, wrapped in the scarf she'd been wearing, improvised compression. He had not looked back at her since they got in the car. Ryu drove. Odaiwon followed in the second vehicle. Nobody talked. At Hanguk Central, they came in through the ambulance bay. She had texted ahead to the charge nurse 4 words. Coming in, 2 patients. And by the time they were through the doors, Dr. Park was already there, looking at Taehyun with an expression that had moved past recognition into something more complicated. Nyla handed Taehyun off with the efficiency of a transfer and turned immediately to Marcus, who was being guided to Bay 2 by a nurse named Choi Hyun, who was one of the good ones, calm and quick, and Nyla followed and stood in the doorway and watched Choi assess the wrist, and took a breath that came from somewhere very low in her chest and let it out slowly. Marcus looked at her from the examination table. His eyes were the same eyes he'd had at 9 years old, following her around that Baltimore apartment. Too big for the situation, taking in too much. I didn't know it was his operation, Marcus said. I swear to you, Neela. The guy who contacted me, the one who said he had documentary investors, I didn't know any of it. I know, she said. I'm serious. He just said he needed someone who could move through the city without drawing attention. Someone who spoke English, someone who looked like... He stopped. Someone who looked like what? Marcus looked at the wall. Someone who looked like they had nothing to do with any of it. A face that read clean. That's what he said. He swallowed. I thought it was legit. There was money. Real money, Nyla. More than anything I've... How much? 3 million won up front. He said 20 more when the job was done. She did the math. Not nothing. Not for 24 and underemployed in a foreign city. She understood it. That was the part she hadn't wanted to get to. The part where she understood it. What was the job? Information. He wanted me to get close to the hospital, talk to staff, find out about a specific patient's recovery schedule. He looked at her and she watched him arrive at what he had to say next. Your patient, the one you were treating. The fluorescent light in Bay 2 buzzed faintly. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor alarmed and was silenced. He wanted my brother to spy on Kang Tae-hyun's recovery, she said. Not a question, saying it out loud to hear what it sounded like. I didn't know who it was. They didn't give me a name. His voice had dropped to something barely above the breath it wrote on. When I started asking around, when I started to figure out that it was something serious, I tried to pull out. That's when they took me. She looked at her brother's face, the cut above his eyebrow, the dried blood on his collar, the wrist that would need imaging she was going to order in the next 10 minutes. She thought about the man who had designed this, who had identified Marcus, recruited him, used him as an instrument of surveillance, and then used him as a hostage when the instrument became a liability. She thought about this particular coldness required to treat a person as a tool that completely and discard it with the same efficiency. Okay, she said. You're going to stay here tonight. Choi is going to take care of your wrist. Don't call anyone. Don't post anything. Do you understand me? Nyla, do you understand me, Marcus? He looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded, and she saw in the nod the particular surrender of a younger sibling who has finally recognized the specific landscape of a mess they cannot navigate alone. She went down the hall to the trauma bay where they had taken Tae-hyun. Park had him on the table, the jacket off, the wound site under proper light for the first time since the warehouse. She stood in the doorway and assessed. The original repair was intact, along 3/4 of its length. The lower margin had separated, not dramatically, maybe 1.5 centimeters of dehiscence, but enough to bleed steadily and enough to need attention. Park was already irrigating. Tae-hyun was awake and watching the ceiling with the expression of someone who has decided the ceiling is the most politically neutral thing in the room. He turned his head when she came in. His eyes found her immediately. Marcus? He said. He's in Bay 2, wrist injury. He'll be fine. She came to the table. You pulled the repair. I'm aware. I'm going to need to know what happened in that warehouse. After Park finishes. I'm asking now. He looked at her. Park glanced up and then looked very deliberately back down at the wound site, which was the professional equivalent of leaving the room. Min-jae was there, Tae-hyun said. His voice was flat and even, and she had learned enough about his voice to know that flatness was where his control lived. With 2 men. Your brother was in the back room. When Min-jae understood we were there, A pause. He made a calculation. He tried to use the situation to make me demonstrate something, in front of my own men. Demonstrate what? That I would choose my organization over a personal attachment. His eyes stayed on hers. He believed that if he framed it correctly, I would have no choice, that my position required a certain kind of decision. And he was wrong about what my position required, Tae-hyun said, and he was wrong about what I would choose. The way he said it, without decoration, without drama, with the simple factual delivery of someone reporting the conclusion of a calculation, hit her somewhere she hadn't prepared a defense for. She kept her face professional. She looked at the wound. She said, You're going to need sutures. Again. I know. And this time you're going to take the full pain management protocol. We can negotiate. We're not negotiating. She looked at him directly. You reopened a 6-week repair at 6 in the morning, rescuing my brother from your own lieutenant. You don't get to negotiate pain management. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved in his expression. Not softness exactly, more like the dropping of a structure that had been held up through effort. All right, he said. Park finished the secondary repair in 40 minutes. Nyla assisted, handing instruments with the automatic fluency of someone who has done this enough times that the movements no longer require thought, just the steady calibration of hands trained to minimize damage. She did not speak unless spoken to. She kept her breathing even. She did not allow herself to think about Marcus and Bay 2 or Min-jae or the warehouse or any of the things she was going to have to think about in an hour when the immediate work was done. She allowed herself exactly the present moment and the sutures and the bright clean light of the trauma bay and the reliable grammar of medical procedure. This was what she had always been able to do. This was the thing that held. Tae-hyun was moved back to the fourth floor at 9:15 in the morning. Different room from before. The hospital had a small number of private rooms on the north side that were used for situations requiring discretion, and the charge nurse, with a pragmatism that Neela respected, had put him in one of those without being asked. Odaewon positioned himself in the corridor. Ryu had disappeared on some errand Neela didn't ask about. She sat down across from Tae-hyun at 9:30 with 2 cups of coffee from the break room, and the door closed and said, "Tell me everything." He did. It took 40 minutes. He was not a man who embellished or who repeated himself or who offered more than the question required, and so the 40 minutes were dense and spare at the same time, like a document that has been edited down to the essential information and nothing else. He told her about Min Jae. 8 years. The specific intelligence of him, the way he had understood Tae-hyun's thinking so well that Tae-hyun had stopped questioning whether Min Jae's reading of a situation matched his own, because it almost always had. Until it hadn't. He told her when he thought it had started to diverge. 6 weeks ago, he said, around the time of the first hospital visit, he had noticed Min Jae watching him in a particular way, not the watching of someone calculating strategy, but the watching of someone recalculating a foundational assumption. He had noticed it, and he had not acted on it because noticing things about the people closest to you and acting on those noticings were 2 completely different risks. And he had spent 8 years trusting Min Jae, and 6 weeks could not simply undo 8 years without evidence. He told her about this flag and the contact logs that had been cleared. He told her about the warehouse and what he had found there, and what he had said to Min Jae, and he told her what Min Jae had said back, which was the part that had the quality of a stone being turned over. Min Jae had said that Tae-hyun had already lost. Not the warehouse, not the immediate situation, had already lost, in the larger sense. That the man sitting in hospital waiting rooms drinking coffee with an American nurse was not the man who had built the organization that Min Jae had given 8 years to, and that Min Jae was not interested in serving whoever that new man was becoming. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When he finished, she sat with it for a moment. "He wasn't wrong," she said, "about the change." Tae-hyun looked at his hands. "No," he said, "he wasn't wrong about that. He was wrong about what it meant." Yes. She drank her coffee. It was terrible. The break room machine had been producing substandard output for 3 weeks, and the work order to service it had been filed and ignored twice. She drank it anyway because she needed something to do with her hands. "The men who took Marcus," she said, "how many people in your organization knew?" Min Jae would have kept it contained. 2, maybe 3 he trusted completely. He paused. Trusted. Past tense. "You dealt with Min Jae in the warehouse." "Yes." "And the others?" "Being dealt with." His voice had no inflection on this. It was a statement of operational fact, delivered in the register he used for operational facts. And she understood that she was not going to get more than that, and that pressing for more than that was not something she was prepared to do right now in this room. She looked at him. The morning light was coming through the window, and it landed on the left side of his face and showed her the particular exhaustion that physical pain and no sleep produced together. A transparency. Like the surface of a person worn thin enough to see through. She thought about what Marcus had said. Someone who looked like they had nothing to do with any of it. She thought about Min Jae, who had watched Tae-hyun sit in plastic chairs for 6 weeks, and had seen in it not a man trying to become something else, but a liability, a weakness, something to be exploited. "There's something else," she said. She hadn't planned to say it now, but the room had a quality that required it. That specific quality of 2 people who have been through something together before dawn and are now sitting in the aftermath with the normal social protocols stripped away. "I need to tell you something." He waited. "I've been tracking the donations," she said. "Not all of them, but enough to build a picture of the scale." She paused. Tae-hyun. It's not just the hospital. It's not just the shelter on Mapodayero. It's 43 individual cases over 4 years that I can document. Probably more that I can't trace. She watched his face. The Lim family. The pediatric equipment. The school in Dobonggu that got its roof repaired anonymously last spring. The after-school program in Yongnam that received a funding injection in March, with no donor on record. She paused. "I'm an accountant's daughter. I know how to follow money. He was very still. Why? She said. It wasn't the first time she'd asked a version of this, but this time she needed the real answer, not the deflection, not the carefully measured non-response she'd gotten before. All of it, the scale of it, why? He looked at her for a long time. The morning light sat on his face, and the room was very quiet. There was a man, he said finally. When I was 17, I was living on the street. I had been for 2 years. There was a winter, very bad, and He stopped, restarted, with the particular care of someone who rarely goes to this part of themselves and does not have fluent language for it. I was not going to survive it. Not the cold specifically. I mean, I had made a decision. The way you make decisions when you are 17 and have been alone for 2 years, and the math of continuing seems worse than the math of not. She held very still. A man found me, he said. An American teacher. He was in Seoul on a program. He was the kind of person who notices what most people decide is not their responsibility to notice. He brought me food. He arranged for a room for 2 weeks while he made calls. He spent his own money. He did not ask anything from me. Taehyun's voice had not changed its pitch or its pace, but there was something in it now that had not been there before. A vibration in the wood of it, the way old structures vibrate when something important is happening. His name was Nathan Mercer. The coffee cup in Nyla's hand went very still. He was a Black American, Taehyun said. He had a family at home, 2 children, a daughter and a son. He talked about them, not constantly, but the way people talk about things that are the center of gravity of their lives. The daughter was already in high school, sharp, he said, stubborn in the right direction. The son was going to be trouble, but the good kind. He looked at her, and his eyes had something in them she had not seen before, not the attention she had grown used to, but something older than attention, something that had been waiting for the right container. His name was Nathan Mercer. Your father. The room did not move. Her hands did not shake. She was a trauma nurse who had trained herself not to go white, not to show the physical signs of shock in moments when showing them would compromise the moment, and that training held now, which was the only thing that held. My father died, she said. The words came out very careful and very level. 6 years ago. I know, he said. I learned that 4 years ago. I hired someone to find him. I had been looking for years. I didn't have much to go on. When I found out he was gone, He stopped. The donations. They started as, I don't have a better word than debt. A debt I could not pay to the person I owed it to, so I paid it outward. Into the things he would have cared about. Families who needed what he had given me. Children who were where I had been. He held her gaze. I did not know his daughter was a nurse. I did not know she had come to Seoul. I did not know when 6 armed men carried me into an emergency room and she stood in the corridor and told them to leave their weapons outside. I did not know she was Nathan's daughter until the 3rd visit. The 3rd visit, she said. You mentioned Baltimore. You mentioned that your father had been a teacher. The specific timing, when he was here, the program. He paused. I did not know how to tell you. I tried to find the right moment, and there was no right moment. And then more time passed, and the absence of a right moment became its own problem. She set down the coffee cup. She set it down very carefully, with the precision she used for delicate things. And she put her hands in her lap, and she looked at the window. Her father. Nathan Mercer, who had gone to Seoul on a cultural exchange program the year Nyla was 16 and come back with stories she'd half listened to about a winter that had been brutal and the kids he'd tried to help, and the particular satisfaction of doing something small that turned out to matter. Nathan, who had died of a heart attack at 58 in a Baltimore hospital while Nyla was doing her nursing rotation 4 floors above him and didn't know he was there until it was already too late. Nathan, who had apparently, in a winter in Seoul 20 years ago, reached down and pulled a 17-year-old boy off a street and back into the world of the living. And that boy had built an empire and spent years trying to give the empire's money back to the kinds of people Nathan would have cared about, And then one October night had been carried bleeding into a hospital where Nathan's daughter was working and had watched her stand alone against 6 armed men without flinching. The shape of it was almost too large to hold. "You should have told me," she said. Her voice was not loud. It was not accusing, exactly. It was the voice of someone who has absorbed a thing and is now determining what to do with it. "You had weeks. You had a dozen conversations. You sat across from me and you knew and you—" "Yes," he said. He did not try to explain it or justify it. He just confirmed it. "I should have told you. I was—" He stopped again. "Afraid is a word I have not used often, but I think that is what it was." She looked at him. The man who had silenced armed men and walked out of a warehouse bleeding and built an empire and quietly dismantled his own fortune in tribute to a kindness he'd received 20 years ago. Afraid. "Of what?" she said. "That you would see the debt," he said, "instead of what was actually—" He stopped himself, looked at the window. "Instead of what this has been." She sat with that. The light moved slightly as a cloud shifted outside. Down the hall she could hear the quiet sounds of the floor running. Footsteps, a cartwheel, a monitor's distant rhythm. The normal machinery of the place where she had built her life, ticking away outside this room where something irreversible had just been said. She was still sitting with it when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Baek Ji-yeon's number. She had it because Tae-hyun had given it to her during the warehouse situation, said if she couldn't reach him to call Baek. She answered. Beck's voice was controlled but compressed, the compression of someone holding a very large fact inside a very small vocal range. "Ms. Mercer, I need to speak to him. Now. It is important." She held the phone toward Tae-hyun. He took it. She watched his face as he listened. She watched the moment the information arrived, the specific quality of stillness that came over him, not the stillness of peace, but the stillness of something that has just been hit hard and is calculating what the hit has broken. He said 2 words in Korean. She understood the first one. It meant, when. He listened to the answer. Then he said 3 more words, slowly, in a register she had never heard from him, lower and more stripped than anything else, the register of something final. He ended the call and held the phone in his hand and looked at it. "Tell me," she said. He looked up at her and his eyes were flat in a way that was different from his usual flatness. This was not control. This was the look of someone who has just been handed a destruction that goes beyond the personal. "Min-jae did not act alone," he said. "The 2 men I left Baek to find, they talked." His voice was very quiet. "Before Min-jae moved against us tonight, he made contact with 3 other organizations. He offered them an arrangement, information about my operation, my structure, my finances, in exchange for their cooperation after I was removed." He paused. "He spent 4 months building that arrangement. He gave them enough to compromise every senior operation I run, banking structures, territory agreements, the identities of 6 people inside legitimate institutions who have been cooperating with us for years." He set the phone on the bed beside him. He built a structure designed to survive my response. Whether I dealt with him or not, the damage was already done. She looked at him. "Those 6 people," she said carefully. "The ones in legitimate institutions. 2 in finance, 1 in the prosecutor's office, 1 in the National Police Agency." A pause that she felt the weight of. 1 in the Ministry of Health." She went very still. "The Ministry of Health." "Who oversees hospital funding and licensing," he said, "including Hanguk Central." The thing she had not seen coming, and she was not someone who failed to see things coming, it was the skill she had spent her adult life sharpening, reading situations before they read her, landed on her chest like a physical weight. Because what he was telling her was not only that his organization had been compromised, he was telling her that the compromise had tendrils that reached into the building she was sitting in. That the funding, the licensing, the structural legitimacy of Hanguk Central was connected, through one person in one ministry, to the criminal architecture that Min-jae had just exposed to 3 rival organizations. And that those 3 rival organizations now had that information, and what they chose to do with it was no longer in Tae-hyun's control. "How long," she said, "before they use it?" He looked at her with the honesty of a man who has run out of anything to protect her from. "Beck says 48 hours. Maybe less." He held her gaze. If they go to the authorities with what Minjai gave them, and they will, because taking down a competitor through regulatory action is cleaner than war and cheaper than negotiation, then everything connected to my organization gets investigated. Everything, including every anonymous donation, including every institution those donations touched. He paused. Including this hospital. She stood up. She stood up because sitting was not something her body could continue to do with this information in it. She walked to the window and looked out at Seoul in the morning light and thought with the cold, stripped-back clarity that she could still always access, no matter what else was happening. What is the situation? What are the assets? What needs to happen? The situation was that in 48 hours, maybe less, everything Taehyun had built, including the shadow architecture of care he had constructed in her father's memory, was going to be exposed in the worst possible context. That the hospital where she worked and the families it served, and the quiet network of human good that he had been funding for 4 years, was going to be buried under the rubble of what Min Jae had detonated. The asset was standing behind her in a hospital bed with a freshly sutured chest wound and 8 years of knowledge about every structure he had ever built. She turned around. "You need to get ahead of it," she said. He looked at her. "Before they go to the authorities," she said, "you go first." "You need to get ahead of it," she said. "Before they go to the authorities, you go first." He looked at her from the hospital bed with the expression of a man who has just been handed a sentence he did not expect and is parsing whether it means what it sounds like it means. "You're telling me to surrender," he said. "I'm telling you to choose the terms," she said. "There's a difference, and you know there's a difference." He was quiet for a moment. The morning light was full in the room now, unambiguous, the kind of light that doesn't allow for soft edges or comfortable shadows. It showed the sutures along his side and the bruising along his jaw that she hadn't noticed in the dark, outside the warehouse, and the particular quality of exhaustion that had settled into his face over the past several hours. Not the exhaustion of a man who is tired, but the exhaustion of a man who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can set it down and is not yet sure whether setting it down will kill him or save him. "If I go to the authorities," he said slowly, "everything I have built gets dismantled." "Yes." "Every operation, every structure, every arrangement." "Yes." "And the people inside those structures get dealt with according to what they did," she said. "Which is how it should work. Which is how you know it should work." She held his gaze. "You built an organization, Taehyun. You also built 43 cases of direct human intervention that I can document. Schools, shelters, families who are alive and housed and educated because of money you chose to redirect. When those things come out, and they will come out, on your terms or on theirs, the story of who you are is not just one thing, but only if you're the one telling it." He looked at the window. She could see him running it. The specific internal calculation of a man whose entire professional existence had been built on controlling outcomes, now faced with an outcome he could only partially control. The rival organizations had 48 hours of information on him. The choice was not whether that information was used. The choice was whether it was used by people who wanted to bury him or by a man who wanted to survive it. "Beck," he said. She handed him the phone. He called. Beck answered on the first ring, which meant Beck had been waiting, which meant Beck already understood what was coming. "I need a meeting," Taehyun said. "Every major organization head in Seoul. Today." A pause. "Yes. Today. I need a location that is mine and neutral, the place in Seongbuk-dong." Another pause. Longer. "Tell them I'm calling the council. Tell them I have a proposal. Tell them—" He stopped, looked at Nyla. Something moved in his face that was not strategic and not calculated, something that had just arrived from somewhere more fundamental. "Tell them the terms of the city are about to change, and they should be present when that happens." He ended the call. He looked at her. "And the authorities," she said. "After the council," he said. "I need to do it in order." "How long do you need?" 6 hours. "You have 48. "I need 6, he said. "The council first. Then I can control what information the authorities receive about the other organizations. If I go to the authorities first, the others disperse, destroy evidence, and Min Jae's gift to them becomes untraceable. If I go to the council first, I can determine what gets preserved and what gets surrendered. He paused. There are people in those organizations who did not choose to be there. There are people who can be moved out before the structure comes down. Mats, she looked at him steadily. You're protecting people inside your own network. Some of them, yes. While dismantling the network. Yes. She sat with that for a moment. Then she stood. I'm going to check on Marcus. Then I'm going to go home and change. Then I'm going to come back and you're going to tell me what you need from me for the next 6 hours. She paused at the door. And Taehyun. He looked at her. After the council. After the authorities. We are going to have a very long conversation about my father. You understand? Yes, he said. She believed him. She left. The 6 hours that followed were the most compressed of Nyla's life since her father's death. And those hours had the same quality. The sensation of time moving at 2 speeds simultaneously, agonizingly slow in the moment and impossible to hold on to in retrospect, like trying to cup running water. She checked Marcus. The imaging confirmed ligament stress without fracture, as she'd suspected. His wrist would be wrapped and rested for 3 weeks. He was sitting up in Bay 2 eating hospital rice with the look of someone who has survived something they do not fully understand yet and is not sure whether to feel grateful or implicated. She sat with him for 12 minutes. She told him he was staying in the hospital today. She told him she would explain everything later. She told him, without elaborating, that their father had done something in Seoul 20 years ago that had mattered in ways neither of them had known. He looked at her. What kind of something? The best kind, she said. The kind that keeps going. She went home. She showered. She changed into clothes that were not blood-spattered scrubs. She made coffee that was better than the hospital machine's output and stood at her kitchen window drinking it and looking at Seoul in the mid-morning light and thought with the clear-eyed pragmatism she had inherited from Nathan Mercer, who had been the most pragmatically compassionate person she had ever known. What is happening? What is real? And what do I actually have the capacity to affect? What was happening was that a man she had not been able to keep herself from caring about. She was done with the equivocating about this. The situation had moved past the point where equivocating was anything but dishonest. Was about to walk into a room full of the most dangerous people in Seoul and tell them he was ending everything, and then walk out of that room and into a conversation with federal prosecutors that would determine the next several years of his life. What was real was that he had done this. He had chosen this. Not because she had forced him to, not because the exposure had forced him to, but because when she had said, "You go first," he had looked at her with the expression of someone who has been waiting to be given permission to become something else, and had taken it. What she had the capacity to effect was limited. She was a nurse, not a lawyer, not a federal negotiator, not a fixer. She could not walk into the Seongbuk-dong meeting. She could not control what happened in that room. But she was also an American citizen with no criminal record and no organizational affiliation, and she had documented 43 cases of anonymous philanthropic intervention by a man who was about to surrender himself to authorities. And documentation in the hands of the right people at the right moment was not nothing. She called the one person she knew who operated at the intersection of law and institutional medicine. A woman named Dr. Estelle Park, no relation to the attending, who ran a global health equity foundation out of Washington, D.C., and who Nyla had met at a conference in Singapore 8 months ago and had stayed in contact with because Estelle was one of those people you stayed in contact with. She was also, Nyla knew from their conversations, connected to both the State Department's Cultural Liaison Office and 3 non-governmental organizations that had formal cooperation agreements with Korean federal prosecutors. Estelle answered on the 3rd ring from what sounded like an airport. "I need a favor," Nyla said. "A significant one. I need it today." "Tell me," Estelle said, because she was that kind of person. Nyla told her. Not everything. Not the warehouse, not Min Jae, not the details that were Taehyun's to deliver in his own context. But the shape of it. A man with a criminal organization who was choosing voluntary cooperation with authorities. Documentation of years of philanthropic intervention. An American citizen in Seoul who needed someone to ensure the cooperation process was handled through legitimate channels with appropriate representation and without the kind of procedural aggression that turned cooperative witnesses into defensive ones. Estelle was quiet for a moment. Then she said, I know someone in the Seoul Western District Prosecutor's office. Good person. Not someone who needs to make a career out of a case. A pause. Can your person hold until 4 o'clock? He can hold until 6, Nyla said. I'll call you by 3. She hung up. She looked at her phone. She thought about Nathan Mercer, who had spent his whole teaching life operating on the belief that the right intervention at the right moment could change the entire trajectory of a human life, and who had been right about that with a comprehensiveness that he never knew. She picked up her keys and went back to the hospital. The council meeting in Seongbuk-dong began at 1 in the afternoon. Nyla knew this because Tae-hyun had told her before he left, and because he had looked at her from the hospital doorway with the particular expression of a man who is doing something he knows he cannot be accompanied on and is doing it anyway. And she had nodded and he had nodded back, and that had been the entirety of the goodbye, which was exactly right, and both of them knew it. She waited. She did her job. She was a trauma nurse. The department did not stop because her personal life was detonating in slow motion across the city. A child came in with a dislocated shoulder from a fall at school. An elderly woman with hypertension whose medication had been incorrectly dispensed by a pharmacy needed to be stabilized, and the pharmacy needed to be called and documented. A young man with a deep laceration across the palm of his right hand from a workplace accident needed 4 hours of careful suture work to preserve the tendon function, and she spent those 4 hours at his side with the precision and concentration that she gave to every patient, because he was her patient and his hand mattered, completely and without qualification, regardless of anything else that was happening in her life or in the city. At 3:14, her phone buzzed. Estelle. Done, Estelle said. Prosecutor's name is Kim Soo-yeon. She'll meet your person at 6:30 at the Western District office. Voluntary cooperation, formal process, representation present. She's been briefed on the general nature of the case, and she is professional. A pause. Nyla, whatever this is, make sure he actually shows up. He'll show up, she said. At 4:57, her phone rang. Tae-hyun. She stepped into the stairwell, the place in the hospital where she went when she needed 30 seconds of privacy, and answered. The counsel is done, he said. His voice was different, not damaged, something else, something lighter in a way that she associated with the specific relief of a decision made and passed through. And 3 of the 5 accepted the terms. The other 2, a pause. The other 2 will be invited to reconsider their position by the prosecutors. He paused. It went differently than I expected. How? One of them. He stopped. She waited. One of them thanked me. He said he had been looking for a way out for 3 years and couldn't find the door. His voice was quiet and strange. I told him I'd have someone contact his lawyers. She leaned against the stairwell wall. Tae-hyun. Yes. Estelle Park set up a meeting. Tonight, 6:30. Western District Prosecutor's Office. Prosecutor Kim Soo-yeon. She paused. You need representation present. Do you have... Beck has already arranged it, he said. 2 hours ago. She almost laughed. Of course she did. A silence. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence that has weight and warmth in it. She was aware of the stairwell's particular smell, concrete and antiseptic, and the faint metallic quality of the ventilation system, and of her own heartbeat, which had been elevated since 6 in the morning and was only now beginning to come down. Nyla, he said, I'm here. After tonight, he stopped, started again. I don't know what the shape of the next period will be. The cooperation process, it will take time. There will be things that become public. There will be... He paused. It will not be simple. I know, she said. I am telling you now clearly so that you understand the complete picture before you... Tae-hyun. She cut him off, gently but completely. I grew up with Nathan Mercer as my father. I understand complicated processes and long timelines. I am a trauma nurse. I work in the middle of situations that are not simple, and I do not leave because they are not simple. A pause. Are we clear? A silence. Then, yes. And underneath the yes, barely audible, in Korean, 2 words she had learned enough to recognize. Gomawo. Thank you. Not polite thank you. The other kind. 6:30, she said. Don't be late. She was back in the department at 5:15 when it went wrong. She was at the nurses' station updating charts when Oh Dae-won came through the main entrance at something close to a run, which was the first signal because Oh did not run. His face had a quality she hadn't seen on it before, not fear, but the specific expression of a man who has assessed an incoming situation and determined that the numbers are bad. He came straight to her. "They moved early," he said. Her hand stopped on the keyboard. "Who?" "The two organizations that did not accept the council terms." His voice was low and fast. "They went to a contact inside the police, not the prosecutors, a different channel, and they filed a complaint that triggers an immediate asset freeze and an emergency warrant." He paused. "The warrant is for this hospital. The Ministry of Health contact, Min Jae, had given them documentation connecting the hospital's anonymized donation receipts to the organization's financial structure. They filed it as evidence of money laundering through a medical institution." He held her gaze. "The warrant team will be here in 40 minutes. She looked at him. 40 minutes. The prosecutor's meeting was at 6:30, which was, she checked the clock, 85 minutes away. The warrant would arrive before Tae-hyun reached Prosecutor Kim, before the voluntary cooperation could be formally established, before the paperwork that would legally reframe what was happening from criminal exposure to cooperative witness. If the warrant landed on the hospital first, everything changed. The cooperation narrative collapsed. The hospital's license went into suspension pending investigation. Every patient on the floor, including Marcus, including the man with the sutured palm in Bay 4, became part of a crime scene. And Tae-hyun, wherever he was right now between Seongbuk-dong and the prosecutor's office, lost the one advantage that Nyla had spent the last 6 hours building, the advantage of going first. She stood up. "Where is he?" she said. "En route," Oh said. 20 minutes from the prosecutor's office. "Call him. Tell him to get there now. Not 6:30. Now." She was already moving, already thinking in the multiple simultaneous tracks that she thought in during a code. What is the immediate threat? What is the asset? What can be moved? What cannot? Can the prosecutor's meeting establish cooperation before a police warrant executes? Oh was on his phone already. If he's in the room and formally identified as a cooperative witness, yes. The warrant would have to be stayed pending the cooperation protocol. 20 minutes, she said. He needs 20 minutes. The warrant team is 40 out. So he has a 20-minute window. Yes. She looked at the department around her. The child with the dislocated shoulder had gone home. The elderly woman was stable and would be transferred to her regular cardiologist tomorrow. The man with the sutured hand was in Bay 4, sedated lightly, his hand immobilized and elevated, 3 days of wound checks ahead of him. The floor was running normally. The floor was running the way a floor runs when nothing has gone wrong yet. She turned to Oh Dae-won. "Tell me what you need to get him to that office in 15 minutes instead of 20. Oh looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of a person. "A distraction," he said slowly. "The two organizations, they have a man outside, watching to confirm the warrant is filed before Tae-hyun can reach the prosecutors. If the man outside loses visibility for 4 minutes, what does that look like? An emergency. Something that requires the immediate attention of anyone on the street." He paused. "Something that looks completely unrelated." She thought for exactly 2 seconds. Then she went to the intercom behind the nurses' station and activated the exterior announcement system, the one used for ambulance coordination on the street in front of the hospital. And she did something she had done twice in her career, and both times meant it. She called a mass casualty alert. Not real. She knew it wasn't real. She would document it correctly in 60 seconds, flag it as a system test, absorb whatever administrative consequence came from the misfiled alert. But for the next 4 minutes, the exterior of Hanguk Central Hospital became an organized, controlled chaos. Vehicles moving, staff appearing at the ambulance bay, the specific high-visibility activity that drew every eye on the street toward the hospital entrance and away from the black vehicle that pulled away from the curb on the north side and accelerated toward the western district. Oh was on his phone. She watched his face. She counted seconds. At the nurse's station, her charge nurse looked at her with an expression that asked several questions at once. Nyla said, "System error. I'm documenting it now. I'll explain to administration tomorrow. The charge nurse held her gaze for a moment, then nodded with the specific loyalty of someone who has worked alongside a person long enough to extend credit. Her phone rang. O's number. "He's in the building," O said. "Prosecutor Kim's office. Formal identification in progress." She exhaled. It came out longer than she expected, the full compressed column of the last 8 hours releasing at once, and she had to put her hand on the nurse's station counter for a second and just breathe. "The warrant?" she said. "Will be stayed," O said. 20 minutes, maybe 30, while the prosecutor's office communicates with the police channel. Long enough. A pause. "Ms. Mercer." She could hear in his voice that he was doing something he didn't normally do, choosing words rather than just deploying them. "He said to tell you something." She waited. He said, "She stood alone in a corridor once before. Tonight she did it again. Tell her I noticed." She stood at the nurse's station with the hospital running around her, monitors and footsteps, and the distant sound of a cart in the corridor. The whole reliable, ordinary machinery of the place she had given 2 years of her life to, and she felt something that she could not immediately name. Not relief, not victory, something older than both of those. Something that had to do with the particular satisfaction of having been exactly where you needed to be at exactly the right moment and having not moved. The warrant team arrived 31 minutes later. By then, Prosecutor Kim Soo-yeon had already filed the formal cooperative witness designation, which meant the lead officer, a compact, tired-looking man named Detective Sergeant Lim, who seemed personally unhappy about the jurisdictional situation he had walked into, had to make 3 phone calls before he could determine that the warrant had been stayed and his team was standing in the lobby of a hospital for no executable purpose. He looked at Nyla, who was standing at the front desk with the charge nurse, and a hospital administrator who had materialized from somewhere upstairs with the anxious efficiency of administrators everywhere. "You called a mass casualty alert," Detective Lim said. "It was not a question." "I called a system test," she said. "It was misfiled. The paperwork is already in." He looked at her for a long moment with the eyes of a man who has lived his entire professional life in the gap between what things are and what they're documented as. "You're the American nurse," he said. "Nyla Mercer," she said. "Yes." He looked at her for another moment. Then he said to his team, "Let's go," and walked out. And she watched him go. And the lobby returned to its normal tempo, and she turned to the hospital administrator and said, "I'll be in your office at 8 tomorrow morning to discuss the alert. I'll bring the documentation." The administrator opened and closed his mouth once and then nodded. She walked back to the department. She sat down at the nurse's station. She updated the chart on the man in Bay 4. She checked the board for the next 4 hours. She breathed. At 9:47 that night, her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't have saved. Not Tae-hyun's regular number, something different, which told her the device situation had changed and would continue changing in the weeks ahead. The text said, "Done. Formal cooperation established. We'll be in contact through counsel. Are you all right?" She looked at the message for a moment, then she typed back, "I'm at work. Patient in Bay 4 needs a wound check in 20 minutes. I'm fine." A pause. Then, "Of course you are." She put the phone in her pocket. She stood up. She went to Bay 4 and checked the man's hand. The sutures were holding, the swelling was within normal parameters, the tendon function would need monitoring, but the preliminary signs were encouraging. And she documented everything correctly and completely, the way she documented everything, because the record mattered and the details mattered, and the patient in Bay 4 deserved the same quality of attention as every other patient she had ever had, regardless of what was burning down or being rebuilt in the city outside. She went home at midnight. She sat at the kitchen table in the same chair she'd sat in the night before, with the legal pad still on the table and the notes still on it, and she looked at the notes and thought about what they would look like to someone who didn't know the story. Just names and locations and dollar amounts and dates. The dry skeleton of something that had, underneath it, a human life trying to honor another human life across 20 years, and an ocean and every possible kind of distance. She thought about Nathan. She did that sometimes, still, sat alone and thought about him directly, not around him, the way you look at something bright. He had been a man who operated with a complete absence of performance. Whatever he did because it was the right thing to do in the situation he was standing in, and the absence of audience was irrelevant to the decision. He had gone to Seoul and found a boy on a street in winter and had made a choice that cost him some money and some time and some effort. And he had never, as far as she knew, told anyone about it. Not her, not her mother, not Marcus. Because the telling of it would have required a kind of accounting that wasn't his point. The accounting had happened anyway, just slowly. The accounting had happened anyway, just slowly. Just across a distance Nathan Mercer never knew he had created. She sat at the kitchen table until 2 in the morning, not sleeping, not trying to sleep. She was doing something she had not allowed herself to do in a long time. Sitting still with a thing that had no immediate action attached to it. No chart to update, no patient to check, no next step to calculate. Just the fact of it. Her father in a Seoul winter 20 years ago, reaching down. A boy's hand reaching up. And everything that had grown from that single point of contact, spreading outward through years and money and violence and kindness, and eventually into this apartment, into this chair, into the life she had built in a city she'd chosen for reasons she thought she understood and now understood differently. She went to bed at 2:15. She slept. In the weeks that followed, the world Kang Tae-hyun had built came apart with the specific methodical efficiency of a legal process that had been handed complete cooperation and knew what to do with it. Prosecutor Kim Soo-yeon turned out to be exactly what Estelle Park had said she was, professional, which in this context meant thorough without being punitive, interested in the full picture rather than the most convenient narrative. The cooperation agreement was comprehensive. Tae-hyun gave them everything: financial structures, territory arrangements, the identities of the 6 institutional contacts Min Jae had exposed, the organizational hierarchies of the 3 rival groups who had tried to use the exposure as a weapon. He gave them the warehouse. He gave them Min Jae. What he did not give them, because they did not need it, and Prosecutor Kim was smart enough not to ask for what she didn't need, was the philanthropic architecture that came out separately through Baek Ji-yeon and 2 accountants and a documentation process that Nyla contributed to with the 43-case file she had been quietly assembling for months. It came out as its own thing, distinct from the criminal cooperation, which was Nyla's doing. She had insisted on that separation with a quiet ferocity that Prosecutor Kim had ultimately respected, because the argument was legally sound, and because Kim was a person who could tell the difference between money used to harm and money used to repair. The hospital's connection to the financial structure was investigated fully and correctly and was found to be exactly what it was: an institution that had received anonymous donations and had no knowledge of their source, which was not a crime and had never been a crime. And the license suspension that Detective Lim's warrant would have triggered never happened because the warrant had been stayed and the cooperation process had made it irrelevant. Tae-hyun was not imprisoned. This surprised people, or some people, the ones who processed the case through the binary of criminal and consequence and expected a sentence at the end. What he received instead was the thing that voluntary cooperation with complete disclosure and a documented history of parallel humanitarian intervention, sometimes produced in a legal system that had room, occasionally, for the full complexity of a human being: a structured accountability agreement. 18 months of supervised compliance, complete divestiture of all criminal assets, which went into a court-administered fund, permanent prohibition from operating in financial structures outside registered and regulated entities, and a provision, inserted at Prosecutor Kim's initiative, that the documented philanthropic work be formalized through a legitimate foundation structure under court oversight for 3 years. Nyla heard the terms from Tae-hyun directly in the hospital cafeteria. Neutral ground, her choice, 10 days after the night of the prosecutor's meeting. He came in through the main entrance, alone, no Ryu, no O, which was the first visible sign of the new shape of things. He looked different in a way she had to look at carefully to identify. Not smaller, more present. Or like a man who has been carrying something at arm's length for a long time and has finally set it down close enough to actually see it. He told her the terms. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, 18 months. Yes. And the foundation? Yes. They want a formal board, legal accountability, annual reporting. He paused. I was told I need a director, someone with documented credibility in medical and social services. He held her gaze with the particular steadiness she had come to understand was his version of deliberate vulnerability. I was hoping I knew someone, She looked at him across the cafeteria table. Around them, the lunchtime noise of the hospital moved, trays and voices, and the particular high-pitched beep of a pager somewhere. And she sat in the middle of it, the way she always sat in the middle of noise, grounded and still. "You're asking me to run a foundation funded by the assets of a criminal organization," she said. "I'm asking you to run a foundation funded by the divestiture of those assets," he said. "Court-administered, fully documented, every dollar traceable." "That's a meaningful distinction." "I think so." She looked at him for a long moment. "What would it do?" He reached into his jacket and produced a single folded piece of paper and slid it across the table. She opened it. It was handwritten. His handwriting, which she had not seen before, small and precise, and slightly uneven in the way of someone who learned to write in one language and thinks in another. A list. Not long. 7 items, a trauma center, a network of maternal health clinics in underserved districts, a school in Dobonggu on the roof, she noted, and 3 classrooms, an after-school program in Jungnang, formalized and funded for 5 years, a shelter expansion, a pediatric equipment fund for public hospitals, and at the bottom, one line, a fellowship in the name of Nathan Mercer for teachers working in international development programs. She looked at the last line for a moment. She looked at it without speaking, with the careful attention she gave to things that required her to be precise about her own reaction rather than just having it. "That was my idea," he said quietly. "Not the lawyers, not the court, mine." She folded the paper. She put it in her pocket. She looked at him. "I need to think about it," she said. "I know. I need more than 10 days. You can have as much time as you need." She nodded. She picked up her coffee. She drank it. And then, because the cafeteria was not the place for the other conversation, the one that had been waiting since the morning in the hospital room when he had told her about Nathan, she said, "Tonight, my apartment, 7 o'clock. Bring nothing except what you actually want to say." He looked at her. "All right," he said. He came at 7. She had cooked rice and the specific jigai she had been slowly learning to make correctly for 2 years, which was still not perfect but was getting closer, which was, she thought, an appropriate metaphor for most things worth doing. She had set the table properly, 2 place settings, which was something she had not done since a dinner party in Baltimore 3 years ago that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. He stood in the doorway of her apartment for a moment before coming in, taking in the space with the slightly careful quality of someone entering territory that requires respect. She watched him do it. He had been in her professional space for months. The waiting room, the corridor, the cafeteria. But this was different, and they both understood it was different. "Sit," she said. He sat. She served the food. They ate. The conversation was quiet at first, the specific quiet of 2 people who have been through something large together and are feeling their way back to ordinary. He said the jigai was good. She said it wasn't right yet. The fermentation was off. She'd been using the wrong brand of paste. He said he knew a market in Mapo that carried the right one. She said she'd been past that market a dozen times and hadn't found it. He said he'd show her. It was such a small and normal thing to say. She held it for a moment without responding. Then she said, "Tell me about the winter." He set down his spoon, he looked at the table, and then he talked. He had not talked about it in 20 years. She understood this not from anything he said, but from the specific quality of his voice as he found the words. The voice of someone accessing a room that has been sealed for a long time, where the air is different, older. He had been 17. His mother had been gone for 2 years. He had been living on the streets of Seoul in the particular invisibility of the homeless young, which was an invisibility that came not from people failing to see him, but from people choosing not to, because the sight of a homeless teenager on a winter street required either action or the decision to not act. And most people made the second choice without being aware they had made a choice at all. Nathan had made the first choice. He had stopped. He had crouched down, which Taehyun described with the kind of detail that told Nyla this image had lived in him for 20 years unchanged. The particular posture of a tall man making himself smaller so as not to be threatening, his breath making clouds in the cold, his face level with a 17-year-old boy who had not been looked at directly in months. He had said, in English, that Taehyun barely understood, "Are you all right?" Not are you hungry, not do you need help, not the performative question that contains its own exit. Are you all right? The question that requires an actual answer. Tae-hyun had said no. The first honest word he had said to another human being in longer than he could remember. Nathan had stayed for 2 hours. He had come back the next day and the day after that. He had used his own money. Teacher's money, not large money, but consistent money, which in Tae-hyun's experience was rarer and more valuable than large. He had arranged a room through a church volunteer program and had not made the arrangement conditional on anything. He had brought food. He had sat with him. He had talked to him about his family, about Nyla, about Marcus, about his wife, with the naturalness of someone who believed that a homeless teenager in Seoul deserved to know that a full human world existed and that he was not outside it. He had left after 3 weeks, as his program required. He had given Tae-hyun an address, his school address in Baltimore, and told him to write. Tae-hyun had not written. Not because he did not want to, but because by the time he had language adequate to the thing Nathan had done for him, enough years had passed that writing seemed like an insufficient response, and he had not yet understood that sufficiency was not the point. He had found the criminal structure by accident, as people usually did, not by seeking it, but by being useful to it in a moment when being useful was the only survival option available, and then by being useful in more moments, and then by being too deep inside it for the exit to be visible. He had been good at it. He did not say this with pride or with shame. He said it with the flat accuracy of someone reporting a fact about themselves that is no longer their identity, but is still part of their history. He had been good at it. He had built something that ran by principles of fear and leverage and consequence, and he had run it with efficiency and without unnecessary cruelty, which he understood now was not the standard he should have been measuring himself against. The money had started going out 4 years ago, not as strategy. As something else, he did not have a clean word for it. Something that had accumulated over years of watching the city that had made him and finding, in the watching, the shapes of the thing Nathan had done. The specific demographic of people who were where he had been, who needed what he had needed, and who were receiving the same average treatment from the same average world. He had started redirecting money. Carefully. Indirectly. Without announcing it, because announcing it would have required explaining it, and explaining it would have required saying Nathan Mercer's name in a context where Nathan's name had no business being. He finished. He picked up his spoon. He ate. Nyla sat across from him, and she did not speak immediately, because what he had said required the respect of not being immediately responded to. She thought about her father. She thought about the specific kind of person Nathan Mercer had been. Not heroic, not dramatic, not performing virtue for an audience. Just a man who looked at what was in front of him and responded to it honestly, and who had apparently done this so completely and so consistently that the response had echoed forward through 20 years in an ocean and had arrived here, in this apartment, in this city, at this table, with this food and this man and her. She said, "He never told us." "No," Tae-hyun said. "That was like him," she said. He didn't collect what he did. It wasn't like that for him. He just did it and moved on to the next thing." She paused. He would have hated a fellowship named after him. Something shifted at the corner of Tae-hyun's mouth. "I thought that might be true," he said. "I'm naming it after him anyway." She looked at him. "He would want it to be useful." "It will be useful." "Then he would accept it," she said. "Probably. While telling you it was unnecessary." "I know," Tae-hyun said. "I would have liked to hear that." She looked at him across the table. The man who had been a boy on a street in winter. The man who had built an empire and spent years quietly trying to give it back. The man who had sat in plastic hospital chairs and invented headaches and drunk bad coffee because he was trying, with the clumsiness of someone who had never been taught how, to be an ordinary human being in the company of someone he could not find a reason to stop returning to. "I'll direct the foundation," she said. He looked at her. "On conditions," she said. "The board is independent. I pick half the members. All programming decisions go through me without veto from any other source. And the Nathan Mercer Fellowship is administered by a committee with at least 2 active classroom teachers on it." She paused. "Non-negotiable." "Agreed," he said, without hesitation, without the pause of someone calculating, just agreed. She nodded. She picked up her spoon. They finished the meal. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in April, when Seoul was doing the specific thing it did in spring, the air lighter, the city's surfaces catching the sun differently, the trees along the Han River in a state of aggressive and emphatic green, the Mercer Medical Foundation opened its first facility. It was not a ribbon cutting. Nyla had been explicitly opposed to a ribbon cutting, which she had described to the foundation's communications coordinator as a piece of theater that prioritized the optics of helping over the act of helping, and the coordinator had agreed because Nyla was the director, and also because she was right. Instead, the trauma center opened on a regular operating schedule at 7 in the morning, and the first patient was triaged at 7:14. And the work began the way work always begins, without ceremony, just the reliable machinery of it, pulling forward. Marcus was there. He had stayed in Seoul. This had surprised Nyla until it hadn't. Marcus, who had always been looking for the thing that was big enough to be worth staying for, had found it in the adjacent current of what the foundation was doing and had attached himself to it with the specific tenacity of someone who has been scared badly enough to stop drifting. He was running the foundation's media and documentation work, which was a real job with real accountability, which he was meeting with a consistency that made Nyla recalibrate the ceiling she had placed on him without being aware she'd placed it. He found her at 9 in the morning, standing in the corridor outside exam room 3, reviewing the intake log. He stood beside her and looked at the list of names on the board. Already 6 patients, the first hour of operation. "Dad would have liked this," he said. She looked at the board. "Yes," she said. "You think he knew? What happened? That the kid made something of himself eventually?" She thought about it. "I don't think he needed to know," she said. "I think that's what made him who he was. He didn't do it for the outcome. He did it because it was what was in front of him." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's a hard way to live," he said. "It's the only way that actually works," she said. He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when something had landed more fully than he expected. Then he went back to work. Taehyun arrived at 11. This was their arrangement. He was not on the foundation's board, not involved in its operations, not present in any way that would complicate the legal clarity of the institution's independence. But he had asked if he could be present on the first day, and she had said yes. And so he came in through the front entrance at 11 in the morning in a jacket she hadn't seen before. Not the dark operational clothing she had learned to read as his armor, but something simpler, gray, unremarkable. And he stood in the lobby of the Mercer Medical Foundation and looked at it. She came down and stood beside him. "How's the morning been?" he said. 11 patients by 10:30, she said. 2 pediatric, 1 chest pain, probable musculoskeletal, not cardiac, 1 laceration requiring sutures. The rest primary care overflow from the district clinic, which is exactly what we anticipated. She paused. "The triage nurse is very good. I poached her from Hanguk Central." Park is still angry about it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. "Good." They stood in the lobby. Through the glass front doors, Seoul did its Saturday thing, people and motion, and the specific ambient energy of a city that did not pause for anything, including the quiet revolutions happening inside individual buildings in individual lives. She had lived here for 2.5 years now. She had learned enough Korean to have real conversations in it. She had learned where to buy the right fermented paste. She had learned, more slowly and more essentially, that the things you stay for are not always the things you came for, and that this was not a failure of planning, but a consequence of being alive and paying attention. "The supervised compliance period," she said, 12 months left. "Yes, and after that, I'm figuring out what a registered, regulated financial structure looks like when built from the ground up," he said. "Beck thinks there's a legitimate private equity model that could support the foundation's long-term funding without the previous architecture." He paused. "It will take time." "Most things worth building do," she said. He looked at her. The lobby light was clean and modern. She had been involved in the design choices, had insisted on lighting that was not institutional and fluorescent, but warm and honest, because light mattered, and people in medical spaces deserved light that didn't make them feel worse. It fell on his face now the way the hospital's morning light had fallen on it in the 4th-floor room 6 months ago, showing her the same transparency. The person close enough to the surface to be visible. "Nyla," he said. "I know," she said. "I haven't said it yet." I know what you're going to say. Then I'd like to say it anyway, he said, because I've spent a very long time not saying things that should have been said, and I've decided to stop doing that. She turned and looked at him directly. I love you, he said, simply, without decoration, in the voice he used for facts he had decided to commit to. I don't know the precise moment it became that specific and that certain. I think it was the corridor, the night you told 6 armed men to leave their weapons outside. I think I started then and did not have language for it until much later. He paused. I wanted you to know, not as a proposal or condition, just as information, accurate information. She looked at him for a moment. She thought about what love looked like in the abstract, the way people described it, the dramatic vocabulary of it. She thought about what it looked like in practice, which was a man sitting in a plastic chair week after week because the alternative was not sitting there, and that alternative was unacceptable to him. A man who answered a 12-hour ultimatum by spending the night finding her brother. A man who had redirected years of criminal money toward the shapes of a kindness he had received and could not repay. A man who had walked into a prosecutor's office and handed over everything because a woman he loved had said, "You go first," and he had understood correctly that she was right. I know, she said. Is that all you're going to say? She almost smiled. No, she said, but I'm going to make you wait for the rest. He looked at her with that quality she had never fully gotten used to. That complete attention, that absolute presence, the eyes of someone for whom looking at her was something they took seriously. And then he did something she had seen him do rarely and had come to value precisely because of its rarity. He let the control drop, just slightly, just at the edges. And what came through was something she recognized from the corridor on that October night, from the OR table, from the plastic chair in the waiting room, from every moment of this strange accumulating story. The quality of a person who has survived their life and arrived, finally and at great cost, at something they did not know they were moving toward. All right, he said, I'll wait. She nodded. She looked at the lobby, at the front desk where the intake coordinator was already managing a walk-in, at the corridor where her triage nurse was moving with the same deliberate unhurry that Nyla herself used, the particular walk of someone who has learned that control in a crisis looks like slowness when it isn't. She looked at the name on the glass above the entrance, the Mercer Medical Foundation. Nathan's name made into a building, made into a place where people came when they were hurt and left less hurt, which was the most direct translation of his life she could have constructed. She looked at all of it, and then she looked at Tai Hyun. Come on, she said. I'll show you the trauma bay. She walked, and he walked beside her, through the lobby and down the corridor toward the back of the building where the real work happened, where it always happened. Not in ceremonies or foundations or documented cases, but in the specific and unrepeatable moment when a person who is hurt comes within reach of someone who knows how to help and chooses to. That was where it lived. That was where it had always lived, in Nathan's winter, and in that October corridor and in every hour since. In the particular and ordinary miracle of one person reaching toward another and the other person not moving away. The corridor was bright. The monitors had their rhythm. The door to the trauma bay was open, and beyond it the morning light came through a window that faced east, and Seoul was out there doing what it did. And neither of them had any idea what the next thing would look like. And neither of them needed to, because the next thing was already beginning, the way all real things begin. Not with a ribbon cut or a speech made, but with 2 people walking through a door and getting to work.